Welcome to Business Matters, Inclusivity and Decision Making. We begin this gathering by acknowledging the land on which Brock is situated is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. My name is Todd Green. I'm an associate professor at the Goodman School of Business. I am the moderator for the 6th edition. We've prepared for 7 of these, but been able to run 6 because of COVID. And tonight we will be discussing inclusivity in decision making. It is supported by the Wilmot Foundation, and it's part of the DG Wilmot Lecture Series. I'd like to thank everyone on our panel for attending and introduce Dean Andrew Godis, who will provide some welcoming remarks.
Hi, Todd. Thank you very much, Todd. And welcome everyone this evening to our special session on business matters and diversity in decision making and inclusiveness in decision making. I think this is a wonderful topic for us, given our year with respect to our being ranked by this global ranking as first in Canada for diversity in class and faculty. This is something that we're particularly proud of. We've taken great strides in our school for its commitment to foster an inclusive and diverse community. Yeah, there's more work to do, of course, but we're proud to share that we're being recognized by a global ranking agency with respect to how we have created a diverse environment within our workplace that is both our faculty and our students, but also within our leadership within our organization, recognizing our student leadership, as well as people we recognize within our community for leadership qualities. I think it's particularly important that not only does the youth of our community see that they have an opportunity for access for business education at the university level, but also that they see that the people who are not only students, but faculty and the leadership and the people who are recognized for leadership qualities, all they see themselves in those individuals. It lends itself for a great opportunity for them to be part of our community and our business school. And why is this important? It leads to the point of the meeting and the discussion this afternoon with respect to diversity in decision making. The fact when you bring multiple perspectives together to look at a question, look at a problem, a challenge, and to offer different perspectives from people's individuals' lenses and the life that they've led and the experiences that they've had, all lends itself very well to having a better informed decision that comes out of the leadership or the individuals that are faced with the challenge of making a decision for an outcome. And so I think the conversation that we're going to have this evening with Yvonne and Ivana and Mark and Leela is going to be a wonderful opportunity to have that conversation as to how we do bring a diverse perspective to the table to make decisions that are not only diverse, but also inclusive of everyone's input towards an outcome and a decision that is pressing at the time. So thank you so much for being part of the conversation this evening. And without any further delay, I open the floor back to Todd to introduce our panel. So thank you so much for tonight.
Thanks very much, Dean Godis. Firstly, we're going to have the panelists introduce themselves, as they know themselves much better than I do at this point. So first to introduce herself will be Leela.
Good evening. My name's Leela MadhavaRau. I am an immigrant settler to Canada, and I have spent my career working in the field of equity, diversity, inclusion. The titles have changed over the decades, and I've moved from Canada to the United States and now back again to Canada. And I currently serve as the Director of Human Rights and Equity at Brock.
Thanks very much. Ivana.
Thanks, Todd. So my name is Ivana Musich, and I'm a VP Managing Director at No Fixed Address, a creative advertising agency that's located in Toronto. And in my role, I manage the delivery of our digital marketing projects, and I manage a lot of the key client relationships as well as the operations, which includes staffing and resource planning. And prior to advertising, I also worked for the Ontario Public Service. And I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk about this very important topic.
Thanks very much. Yvonne.
Good afternoon. My name is Yvonne Nozri. I am the Director of Human Resources at Hospice Niagara, and I also run my own HR consulting firm called Victory & Company. I am a settler to Canada, as is my husband, and we are a multicultural family. And I am looking forward to the discussion this evening and sharing how human resources is impacted.
And finally, Mark.
Great. Thanks very much, Todd. Good afternoon, everyone, or perhaps evening, depending on where people are, or even morning. My name is Mark Dockstator, and coming to you from Southern Ontario in the land acknowledgement. You mentioned the Haudenosaunee. I am one of those Haudenosaunee on whose land we are meeting, so thank you very much for the land introduction and acknowledgement. So First Nations here from Southern Ontario. Lawyer, currently working in the academy, universities. I'm at Trent University, associated with Queen's University, and prior to this was the president of First Nations University out in Saskatchewan. It's a pleasure to be here, and again, thanks for the invitation. Look forward to the discussion.
Sure. Thanks so much again for taking time and being part of this important discussion. To open it up, I'd like to hear from all of you, what exactly does a term like inclusivity mean to you? And that can be both as an individual or in your daily job roles as well. And we can have a very open discussion for whomever would like to kick off. Or I can also select someone. Yvonne.
Did you say Ivana or Yvonne? Ivana, right?
Oh yes, this will be a never end. Well, not never ending because it ends at around 8:30. But I don't want to confuse the two of you for the whole night. Yeah. Either or. You're unmuted, Ivana. So by all means.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, to me, inclusivity in the workplace is really a philosophy. I mean, it's a way of doing business that is open-minded, that is welcoming, that is equitable, and that I think proactively considers barriers that certain groups of people may face, either at their current job or when it comes to getting a job. To me, it's about providing the tools and the resources and putting specific processes in place that ensure that your work is basically a safe space where honest and vulnerable conversations can happen, and where people feel safe being themselves, where they feel safe expressing themselves in their jobs and are feeling supported regardless of, who they are or where they come from. I mean, to me, inclusion really requires that everyone's contributions are valued and that individuals have the opportunity to do their best work and to thrive.
And either Leela or Yvonne?
Sure, I can pick up from that. So I agree with what Ivana was saying. I think from an HR perspective, if you're looking at the organization as how to create an inclusive work environment, we hear lots of organizations say they value diversity and inclusion. However, they're not necessarily taking proactive steps to invite others in and to seek out that diversity. So I think part of what an organization should be doing in that is to meet people where they're at as well. So we're going to create that safe place, like Ivana was talking about, where we can have those open discussions and make that a culturally aware and inclusive workplace. But we also have to seek out the opportunity where candidates who might not be looking at the traditional Indeeds or LinkedIn for job opportunities, we may want to seek out other places such as Nation Talk or Surf Niagara to bring people in. So it's just thinking outside of your own box and thinking, if this is a value, where can I go to speak to others who may be able to offer this to us and work together with us.
Leela.
I think I agree in terms of a definition of inclusion with what's been said. I think what is a lot harder is making it happen. And there's a tendency to feel that you put a group of people in a container, shake them all up, and somehow you have inclusion. And I think we need to be really careful to think about what we are doing, particularly at this moment in time when there is a lot of initiatives which talk about inclusion, in some cases really meaning structural diversity. They just want to have representation by the numbers. Sometimes they would like to have an inclusive environment, but don't necessarily, as Yvonne said, go about creating it in the right way. And I think that one of the questions that we've been talking about is, if you're a truly inclusive environment, how are you going to describe yourself to others without sounding like exactly like every other place in Canada, which is trying to say that it's an inclusive environment? And I would actually have probably more respect for those who are able to say that they're part of a journey towards inclusion and haven't got it all right, and they know they're making mistakes along the path towards inclusion, and that they're nowhere near decolonization and reconciliation, but they're open to learning and relearning, than those who simply announce that they have an inclusive environment.
And Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with the conversation that's been going on to this point on defining inclusivity. Usually, my experience is that I come in to contact with organizations in the private sector and in the public sector as well, and inclusivity comes usually as a part of an acronym. It's EDI or ESG or TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And inclusivity is part of that acronym one way or the other. Usually, and if we have this conversation, I usually approach it from the perspective of the truth and reconciliation approach, which is, there's truth and there's reconciliation. So what's the truth about your organization? Of why do you think it's not inclusive? Why is it that you want to be more inclusive or more diverse? And what does that mean to you? So that the truth-telling part, usually from my perspective anyway, precedes the conversation on becoming more diverse. If you weren't before, why was that? And if you want to be now, what's your motivation? If it's to check a few boxes off, then I don't think that's necessarily going to get you to being a more inclusive and diverse workplace and workforce. So I usually begin with that. Again, a lot of people sort of bypass that and go right to reconciliation. We want to start a new relationship, and we want to start out with a clean slate. I said, well, let's go to the truth part first. That slate's not entirely clear, so you just can't wipe it away and pretend it didn't happen, or that you're starting from ground zero and it's a perfect place. You really have to go back and look at the origins. You have to look at the context. You have to look at the history of your organization and the larger context as well, and have that conversation first. Then we can proceed through a process, a discussion, a dialogue. I mean, there's a lot of literature out there, but as Leela mentioned, it's a process. And I usually start to begin that process from a starting point of, well, let's be truthful about where you are right now, how you got there, and why you want to change. That might get us to being more inclusive, or it might not, but I think it's a good starting point. So, like I said, I usually get the idea of inclusivity through these acronyms. And one thing that I do also mention from an Indigenous perspective, that, if you look at something like an umbrella term like EDI, don't think that Indigenous necessarily falls under that. It doesn't. And I caution against, looking at Indigenous issues from an umbrella term that captures certainly a lot in which Indigenous people are supportive of, but doesn't necessarily capture Indigenous perspectives by these acronyms, which are very trendy at the time, but require, I think, more thought and consideration in moving forward.
I really like this idea of looking at it as a process versus sort of, oh, we've arrived because we've drafted an inclusive policy in our hiring or something along. It does also make me, when Leela mentioned the organizations that admit they're not perfect. It made me think of Marks and Spencer when I was living in the UK. In their social responsibility report, they say, here are all the things we do well, but here are all the things that we need to do much better. And I feel like one of the, and there is a point and a segue to my next question. I feel like social responsibility or environmental practices sometimes fall victim to the idea of being a buzzword as well, and always saying, here's all the great things we do. So I'd love to hear from all of you. How do you get past inclusivity simply being a buzzword in organizations? And we can go in any order if anyone is particularly interested. Leela.
This is, in this field that I work in, I feel like this is something that comes up all the time. It's partly why my titles at my work have always changed depending on whatever the buzzword at the moment is. And I find it really difficult because a lot of them are aspirational terms. We want to be inclusive. We want to show equity. We want to be diverse, and they don't really speak to truth telling at all, because in many cases, people are wanting that veneer on top just to show that they're meeting whatever the current test of the moment is. However, I think there are ways of being able to take the word and, I was going to say, twist it to one's own ends, which sounds much more sort of nefarious than I mean it to be. But, when I was stuck with a title of an office that included the word diversity, in a university, students were always so very angry. How could this word, this is a meaningless word. It means nothing. It's just talks about structural diversity, has nothing to do with change. And what I'd tell them is, let's think about it. Yes, it can mean structural diversity, but how can we take that term and imbue it with what we want to become? Where do we want to go? What will our journey be? And they'll never be the perfect term, but as we're using the terminology that people recognize, make sure we define it. What does it mean for us to say that we're inclusive? And I think Mark's point is very well taken, that there has to be, in talking about inclusivity, talk about equity, talking about diversity, how do we frame that in settler colonialism? How do we work through all of those things without simply saying inclusion? And the last thing I'll say is, I was just reading an article today which was talking about the current use of BIPOC. And so before coming back to Brock, I'd been in the US in Southern California for 16 years, and people of color was the phrase that was used. And this was an American article. So but it said that in many ways, in using the term BIPOC, what are we saying? We're calling out Black people from the rest of people of color. What message is there? We're putting Indigenous in a category, and then we have a lump of people of color. Is it better to go with a holistic lump where everyone knows people of color? Or do we go for a term like BIPOC, which appears superficially to give precedence to groups that have been on the receiving end of the worst of Canada, and lump everyone else in together? And I don't know, but it's those questions that we have to untangle, and we have to think about it. And then we have to define why we're using those terms and why we might not use those terms. If I choose to continue to use people of color, maybe I should give that rationale as to why I'm choosing to do that.
Thanks. Anyone else would like to add on that?
I think if I can speak from the corporate world and that perspective, I think one of the reasons why it's been really hard to go beyond inclusivity just being a buzzword is because it requires organizations to really look deep within themselves and their culture and their practices to see if they're inclusive. I mean, it's hard because you have to admit some really hard truths and take accountability for certain practices that may have been allowed to go on for a long time. And it's a difficult conversation for a lot of the businesses and corporations to have. And some of these practices may have been completely unconscious. And I think the whole point of this is to learn what your blind spots are and to, I mean, hire help from the outside if you need to help you assess your behaviors. I mean, to me, this is no different than therapy for individuals who want to get a better understanding of themselves and who they are. It's, you know, you hire a therapist to help you, because it's really hard to see yourself outside of the box when you're in the box. And I think it's a very uncomfortable conversation to have for a lot of the leaders and for a lot of people in the corporate world. And I think that's why it's been difficult, and it's easier to say we are inclusive and post on social media, because doing the work is hard because you essentially have to call yourself out.
That's a fantastic point. I was also thinking as you were speaking, in advertising, it's probably a lot easier to come up with a brilliant hashtag or a very nice creative content or a wonderful advertisement, such like Nike does very, very moving advertisements, but, you know, and I'm not picking on them in any way, but do they themselves look at themselves through that lens as well? Mark, and then Yvonne?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and certainly one, you know, that I ask again when I'm working with private sector and organizations. And how do you get beyond just using this as a buzzword and the superficiality that's associated with that particular term? In some instances, I find they're not looking at getting beyond a buzzword. It is trendy. It is something that we want to do. We're motivated, certainly, but we're motivated in a certain way. And then when I start asking the questions and we peel back the layers a bit, that's where you find how deep the motivation goes. And, the idea would be that, well, what is it that you want to accomplish exactly with inclusive decision-making or diversity? And how far is it that you want to go? What are you going to change? And if the answer comes back, I don't know if we're changing anything, I said, well, then it doesn't automatically appear in some way. You wave the magic acronym and it occurs. It's as the other panelists are talking about as well. It's a process that requires a lot of thought. It requires change. And organizations and individuals sometimes, we don't like change, and if we do, we don't want it to be negative. And so that idea of changing and doing something different in order to increase diversity, increase inclusion, sometimes, as mentioned by Ivana, it is a difficult conversation to have, and I find that some organizations aren't ready to go there yet. We are motivated, but it is more ESG. We want to get ratings, and we want to get investors. We want to, look as though we are doing these things that we necessarily have to do. And when I start asking the questions of, well, how are you going to attract a more diverse workforce? Are you going to change your recruiting methods? Are you going to go further into your policies and procedures and change that? Is this going to be an organization-wide approach, or just some recruiter going out there trying to recruit people of color? And through those questions and through that process, sometimes you find that, there are organizations that aren't really willing to go beyond the buzzword, and it remains just that. It's an exercise, but it's not something that, they're deeply committed to, but they are committed, but not, like I said, to go into fundamental or substantive change in order to accomplish those goals. It's more, as one student put it to me, faces and places. We want to have more faces that are diverse, and we want to name some places after, for example, Indigenous peoples, but we're not looking to change the system. We're looking to change how we appear. So it's like I said, sometimes it's a great question to ask of how deep do you want to go? And you find that, well, we just want to scratch the surface, or, take an ice cube off the iceberg. We don't want to look below the iceberg or go too deep on that.
Thanks very much. Yvonne?
I think, I'll use some of the words that my colleagues here today have shared as well. I think organizational change takes a considerable amount of time and effort to go through. So it is that journey and creating that readiness within your environment in order to truly become an inclusive place to work and practice whatever type of work that is that you do in a truly inclusive place. It really does take that inward look and aligning, why is the value of diversity or why is the value of inclusiveness important to our organization? And some, that might seem like a very obvious answer, but it's worth a really deep discussion in figuring out what that really truly means. And I think going through some organizational readiness in regards to, you know, self-reflection activities on, you know, unconscious bias, or looking at, you know, different cultural safety and cultural awareness type trainings, anti-racism, anti-oppression. What does that mean? And having some guided conversation through probably a third party, again, to kind of navigate what that looks like, but create those change and do that debrief and realize how that is going to shift within your organization. You have to be fully committed to it, and you have to recognize it does take time, and that uncomfortable conversation does have to happen, but hopefully whomever is running that creates that safe space for everyone to participate in that exploration.
Yeah, Leela.
I was thinking and reflecting on what everyone was saying, and I think with what Yvonne was just mentioning, that part of, as we think about buzzwords, if we think about buzzwords from the other direction, many people have a very hard time if they're called racist. They just react in all sorts of ways, rather than taking it as an opportunity to think about what they may have said, what may have, their actions may have been. And I think that it definitely, when we're talking about doing this at an organizational level, all the work I do, I get people to begin with themselves, because I don't believe you can do any training, anti-bias training, without having someone think about who they are and where they're placed, and basic questions like when they first became aware of race. Some people in, you know, up Brock may say they didn't become aware of it till they went to university. I became aware of it because I got called names, and I went home and asked what those names meant, and I got told what those names meant. You hear it in different ways, and thinking about that, the position that you're in, leads people to be able to think about the buzzwords of power and privilege, and being able to consider what that means without the automatic rejection of those. And I think that it means those conversations as well sort of focus on the other buzzwords that come up, which come in for a lot of negative attention when people talk about white supremacy, power, privilege. People in my field get made fun of a lot for having those conversations, but unless we put them out there, it's very hard to get to the core of where we want to be. And I was just going to say to Mark, in thinking about the iceberg, you talked about phases and places, and I use food and fiesta. So we stick with what's comfortable rather than going down below to those points that really strike at the heart of who we are and how we interact with others.
Now, I'll transition just a little bit, because we are, it's in the context of a business school discussion, and oftentimes we look at measures and benefits attached to decision making, and things like if we add a successful hashtag that gets retweeted 1 million times or gets more positive responses on YouTube versus negative. So, but again, it would be within your context of your experience. I'm interested to know what benefits you see from inclusive decision making, and making sure that inclusivity is part of organizations as well.
I think having inclusivity conversations and having that sort of decision-making model that considers that really can lead to, and again, from a business school perspective and looking at those outcomes, I think it can really lead to positive change within a workplace, I think it can lead to new ways of thinking, innovation, learning to do better. And when we're considering from others' perspectives and looking through it through the lens of others, I think that that can only lead to better, longer, more sustainable outcomes.
Thanks very much. Ivana.
Yeah, agreed. And just to build on that specifically when it comes to advertising, because we are in a creative field, I mean, I've seen it lead to obviously better culture and work environment and higher productivity, but also just better quality of work. I think especially in advertising, it's important to challenge our own point of view and ensure that we're not making assumptions and generalizations, and in our advertising that we're not offending groups of people in our messages, and just to make sure that we're being sensitive and that the communications we produce are not tone deaf, and that you ensure that by having an inclusive and diverse workplace where those individuals are able to contribute to those ideas. And at the end of the day, we all want to be seen and we all want to be heard. And I think inclusive practices not only allow us to do that, but I mean, they really allow our best selves to show up and emerge at work. And if we're in business of creativity, I think it definitely directly impacts our ability to be creative and to be innovative. And that's our bread and butter in advertising. So, I mean, Todd, we've spoken about what happens when a bunch of old white guys sit at a table and think about what the next car commercial looks like, and it doesn't go well.
Fortunately, I'm only kind of an old white guy, so I'm not quite yet in that I'm on my way based on how long it takes me to get out of bed in the morning, but not quite there. But yeah, I mean, and what you suggested to me is sometimes it almost seems like trying to avoid a negative outcome in a way too, or being protective of the brand by not offending people with your message, which I don't know. So I don't mean to kind of jump around a little bit here, but Leela, when you said that people in your field get made fun of, it actually made me feel very sad in many ways, because I think, why would we not want to benefit from this conversation? But anyways, Leela, you're ready to go.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, I could give many reasons why people doing sort of equity work get being made fun of is actually the best of all options, because the worst of all options is that people doing this work, you know, also get death threats. So I would rather be made fun of, quite frankly. But thinking about the benefits of inclusive decision making, particularly I've done a number of workshops for different student groups at Goodman. And I always start off by talking about the business case for diversity. People make more money, they're more productive if they have, you know, structural diversity is mainly what's being talked about. When affirmative action was threatened in the United States and the Fortune 100 companies all put in amicus briefs to the Supreme Court, it wasn't really because they were making the moral case for equity and affirmative action. It was because they know they need a structurally diverse pool coming into their corporations in order to make more money and to get the very best product. And I think that's why for some of them, parlaying that into true inclusion at least there's some foundation there. But the other question that I've been asking the students is, what's decision making if it's not inclusive? I mean, I've been trying to, you know, we talk about inclusive decision making. Shouldn't by definition the decisions that we're making be inclusive? If not, it would appear that it's simply ruling by fiat or diktat. So, but just getting them to think about best practices for decision making, and how would that be different if we were to have a list of inclusive decision making when we think about the best practices? And often it's not actually that different. But I think it sometimes seems harder when we layer in be an inclusive decision maker, even though it may be many people's natural goal. It's just how they would go about doing things.
Yvonne.
Hi, Todd. Sorry, I was disconnected. I'm not quite sure what the current question is.
Oh, sorry, no problem. We're talking about the benefits related to inclusive decision making.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. That's not what I had answered last. Okay. So I think, yeah, the benefits to it are really, again, I think going back to that more innovative type environment, I think it can lead to that as we explore others' perspectives. I think the benefits also are if you're using inclusive decision-making models at the onset of any new project or initiative within your organization, you're going to be able to create better buy-in from your team as you launch through an initiative. I think that that is really helpful from the get-go to help manage through any new.
And Mark.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, we're looking at it from somewhat of an academic perspective of both, and you know, the academy, we look at theory as well as some practice. And then from the theoretical perspective, I tend not to, when I work with organizations, go into the benefits of diverse decision making and the benefits of it and inclusivity. I think the case that has been made, I ask them to educate themselves. There's a lot of literature out there, and I think that they can do that on their own. And if they can't, I give them, you know, some examples. Sometimes it's usually from an Indigenous perspective that, you know, what's stronger, monoculture or a diverse forest? And when under pressure or when forced with change, diversity is the strength that you want to have within your organization, just as in any natural system. Human-based systems are the same. And when I look at, a lot of times, like I said, the theory and the practice, I tend to look at the practical part and the applied perspective of, you know, how do you actually do this so that it is successful, and try to walk through what some of those stages or those steps might be. And from a metrics perspective, that is, there's some kind of management accountability framework that an organization is looking at. And as I said before, hopefully they're not just checking the boxes. And I do like to bring up the negative part of that to say that, well, if you don't support, you know, inclusivity and diversity within your workforce and within the workplace, and you're not sharing power, that is, you know, you just hire diverse people at the bottom of the pyramid and they don't have any input, they don't have any real power within the organization, then what are you going to do when that fails? You know, what are your metrics going to look like when you know, go down this particular road and it doesn't work out? So it's, you know, there are benefits to that, but if you don't do it properly, then there are negative connotations associated. And again, you mentioned the idea and the concept of, you know, accountability frameworks and metrics and how you measure. And if you measure failure, that never looks good in an organization. So in order to avoid that and getting to that end result, you know, preemptively looking at what the future might be, then you want to look at how you do this within the organization to ensure that it's going to be successful. And a lot of that, as we talked about before, is going to entail change. And one of those big changes that I do mention is the idea that at some point in time, you might have to look at sharing power. You know, we've talked about privilege and we talked about power, and the idea of keeping it and not sharing it and then trying to be more diverse and leading to a more inclusive workplace. If you're not going to share that power structure within what you're trying to accomplish, then you are looking at, you know, a failure or at least a less successful venture or initiative than what you're envisioning right now. So I do tend to focus somewhat on that practical and applied perspective as well, to say, well, if you are to walk through these stages and this is where you want to go, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get there. And one of those key metrics that I like to point out is that idea of, you know, if you're just hiring janitors and you expect a more diverse workplace and decision making, that's not necessarily what you're going to get better numbers, but you're not going to get an inclusive workplace that's going to be successful in including that diversity and breaking down those barriers in what you want to be as an organization.
Yeah, and one thing I have noticed is that a lot of organizations will say, you know, 10% of our global employees or our management team or are made up of a diverse set of people. And I feel like sometimes it's sort of used as a tool or a pat on the back at times and saying, you know, we're going to do we're going to invest X million of dollars in scholarships for some traditionally marginalized groups, and then it's you know, it's in an ad, and then that's maybe it. And now they're on to perhaps the next campaign. And so, yeah, I did really wonder about the metrics and the measurement, because even in the area that I research, corporate social responsibility can be measured millions of different ways, and it can lead to so many different findings. And how do you define it? And is it only environmental, or is it having a yoga facility on site, or, you know, investing in training for your employees? So I feel like the metrics and measurement of inclusivity would be really, really important to sort of avoid maybe being window dressed, perhaps, and being used as a marketing opportunity. Someone mentioned earlier about blind spots and biases. I think it was in relation to looking inward, and I think it was related back to therapy. I did want to build on that point a little bit. How do you address and how do you identify biases within organizations, and how do you arrive at finding blind spots as well to address them?
This is a bit of, oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Yvonne.
Oh, no, go ahead, Yvonne.
You first.
I was going to say, when I was mentioning the idea of therapy and blind spots, oftentimes you need to get help from the outside. From what I've seen in some of the organizations that I've worked with, the first step is to admit that there's a problem. So it really has to start with acknowledgement. You cannot fix anything if you're not clear on what the problem is, and there's no point in tiptoeing around the issue. And I think we spoke about that. So one is to acknowledge, and then the second, from what I've seen, what was done successfully in some organizations that I worked with, they would hire an outside consultant or an auditor or just a neutral third party that would make employees feel comfortable when it comes to sharing their experience. You know, sometimes organizations send out anonymous surveys that come from management, and that doesn't work. I think there needs to be a third party who's taking charge of all the conversations where management is actually not included. They get to see the results at the end of the process once the audit has been completed. And then some other things that I've seen is you know, proactively facilitating conversations and group discussions, setting time aside at work to talk about certain topics, and actually have the leadership team there, because I believe it really does start at the top. The leadership team needs to lead by example and show the other employees that it's okay to have these difficult conversations, and that they're open to it. Because otherwise, if just the employees are the ones who are doing all the work, they're going to get tired, and they're going to really lose steam, because they're going to get to the point where they say, well, what's the point? Nothing's going to change, so why would I care? And that's probably worse, accepting that reality, than leaving the workplace. So I think that's where the danger is.
Thanks very much. Yvonne.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that organizations helping to facilitate that individual exploration of, you know, what are some biases that may exist within myself, and then facilitating conversations about how that becomes, how that translates into the work environment and the services you're providing outwards. And I agree that it really should be facilitated conversations to help guide that. But it does absolutely take that self-reflection before we can look at the systemic issues within the organization.
Thanks, Yvonne. Leela.
I think that it begins, well, some of the ways it begins is thinking about the conversations and the language we use. And so we would think about, what does the word blind spot mean? What does it mean when you use it to your blind employees? Does it mean they're not seeing something, they're missing something, they're lacking something? So I would say we look at our language if we're going to think about inclusivity. I think the discussion around inclusive language is something that is another one of those things that you can read endless memes about being politically correct and the like. And I think it's just thinking about the language that we use and what does it mean to people. So that's an aside. I obviously agree that we have to look at our own biases and we have to have people be able to discuss them. I'm not quite so sanguine about the ability to have courageous conversations without a lot of work, and for people to admit their biases. Because if you're going to stand up in a meeting as a leader and admit that you know that you're racist, that your first inclination when you see X person is crossing to the other side of the road, how's everyone else, especially people from X group, going to look at you after that? And so when we say we want to have the courageous conversation, we need to know exactly what we're going to do, which is maybe why having a third party is useful. I could argue the other side of that. But what I was going to say is there's also this difference between creating safe spaces and brave spaces. And I think too often we say we're going to create a safe space. A safe space keeps things somewhat superficial, occasionally venturing into territory that seems a bit daring, uttering some words around power and privilege. A brave space would come with perhaps a different format, and it would say, we are going to put these things out on the table because that's how we're really going to make a difference. And we're going to deal with those consequences. The ways that those biases, we know the biases come about because due to no fault of our own, what we imbibe as we're young, as we move through the world with people we don't know. But I think that there has to be a great deal of caution with suddenly introducing those into spaces that have not engaged in such discussions before. So for me, there's that differentiation that exists between safe spaces and brave spaces in order to be able to truly move forward.
Thanks very much, Leela. Mark.
Yes, it's always an interesting concept of how to spot bias. And I was interested, my son, who, let me brag about my son, did his master's on artificial intelligence and how do you spot bias in computer programs and in human-based interactions with artificial intelligence and bias. And that's a great way of looking at things from a non-human perspective. From a human perspective, I usually bring in the concept, and it's an Indigenous perspective, of holism and holistic thought, and looking at the entirety of the situation from different perspectives as a starting point. And it's referred to as 360-degree vision or two-eyed seeing, but or sometimes it's referred to by the concept of respect and respecting others and their views. Respect in this context of Indigenous knowledge and philosophy means, well, expect to look and read to do it again. So to look at things again and to do it from different perspectives. And that 360-degree vision is the idea of a circle that if you walk around a particular issue and look at it from all the different perspectives, then you have a holistic understanding. Then you have respect for that particular issue because you're looking at it and incorporating these different perspectives into your understanding. So if you're interested in looking at things from, like I said, a larger perspective, a whole perspective, and the entirety of a situation, then you can get into, I think, uncovering bias, whether it's unconscious bias, and whether somebody can assist you with that, I think is also something to look at. It's like driving a car. If a person says, "I'm a great driver," I said, "Well, not according to your passengers. You're a terrible driver." Well, you have an unconscious bias that you're really good, or that you don't check your mirrors or your blind spot before you turn and you cut people off all the time. You really have to look around. You have to check from different perspectives, and you have to look at different ways and views of looking at things. And like I said, when I go to organizations, I sometimes introduce that concept of holism and holistic thought, of not dissecting and segmenting, differentiating, and siloing, decision making or looking at different perspectives, but to bring the together in that holistic vision and walking around things to respect it, to incorporate those different ways of looking, and you'll uncover bias, I think, in that way or through an assisted process to help you uncover that bias. Maybe you're not the great driver you think you are, and other people can help you point that out before you wreck the car.
Yeah, I'm not even a car person, but we'll stick with the car discussion for a moment. I remember one of my colleagues saying that when we see someone else sort of run through a red light when they probably should have stopped, we think it's because they're an awful person or a horrible driver, and when we do it, we think, I was just too late to stop at the yellow. I was already kind of going through, and so it's sort of a simple application of attribution theory, and I think it's probably related to biases as well. We maybe attribute really negative motives to other people being biased, but then perhaps forgive ourselves. And I wondered, it made me think that that's those hard questions and the hard dialogue, we might not want to admit to it, and it feels kind of similar to the motives that we ascribe to other people making mistakes. It's we think of other people as being sort of evil intentions, but give ourselves a pass perhaps for having those biases. But yeah,
it's the intent versus impact. Our intentions are always good, even when the impact on others may be very negative. And we tend to say, then because we're good, we say, but I didn't mean it. I didn't mean when I said that. But that's irrelevant to the person who's being impacted. So I think that's the shorthand that I tend to use is that just the intent versus impact, and to remember saying I didn't mean it is meaningless to the other person.
Yes, and we do often see, whether it's social media apologies, when brands will say that's not who we are, or rather than confronting it directly, they'll sort of give themselves a pass to say, that's not who we are. But when we all met as a group, there are some brands that are on their 30th apology for making an offensive social media campaign. And you think, it could be who you are. There's a good chance that is who you are if you have now had to apologize for all of these past behaviors. One of the things that, as we were putting together this panel, is that we recognized, and we had our own moment of self-reflection before we moved ahead with the panel, is that we obviously don't have all voices included in a panel discussion of 5. So how do you ensure that you have all voices, or have you seen instances when some voices simply don't want to be part of the inclusivity discussion as well? You can address the second part of the question separately. We can go with the first.
I think it may be difficult to have all voices represented at all times. I think that's a very lofty goal. So I'm not sure that is something that can be accomplished. However, I think really, again, in order to create that genuine opportunity to have all voices included, or as many voices included, to create that inclusive environment, you have to be genuine in why you're asking for that and how you're going about it, and the reason why their voice is important and why everyone's voice is important. And what you're going to do with that. I think you have to be able to identify how that is going to lead to change, or what impact. I think the intent versus impact is an important topic to be clear on before you go seeking for that. I feel that in some circumstances, there may be hesitation to participate where there is where it appears to be a lack of authenticity behind the reasons why. I think that's very important. If you're playing the numbers game of, we want representation from 12 different backgrounds or what have you, and again, it's to check a box, that may not be the reason why somebody wants to participate. Yeah,
absolutely. We talked a little bit about that, about even, cover pages of websites are often, look, we have people from all over the world and they all like each other while they're drinking a Pepsi or a Coke. Therefore, we're bringing people together with our product, and maybe internally that brand doesn't actually support it. But yeah, Leela.
Yeah, I agree with all that Yvonne said. I think it's impossible to be able to have all voices, and I think we have to acknowledge it because each of us is representing our own being, and we're different to those next to us and different members of our family. And I think being wholly representative, it would be a very hard thing to do. I think that one needs to be clear about what the gaps are. And I think to be clear about the gaps, particularly when people have chosen not to be a part of a particular conversation or discussion or initiative, which, as Yvonne said, I think is often because people feel it's not genuine, that it's simply another pro forma exercise that's being done to check a box or for a lovely, glorious picture. And so I think it means that when there is that gap, there needs to be a lot of thinking about the reason, the rationale, and how the group is thinking about why you're doing it. And I would think that would be a failure of that for that particular initiative. But I think we have to always acknowledge that we can never be fully representative in any discussion that we're having, and simply acknowledge that up front.
Yeah, Ivana.
I agree with everything that's been said, and Todd, you said something interesting about having a nice homepage on the website that talks about the numbers and how diverse organizations are. But I think the real question is, if you say that X% of your leadership team is women or people of color, the real question is, how do they feel in their jobs, and do they feel that they have the power to be themselves and to make decisions? I mean, I've seen organizations that are diverse on paper, but when you look at the culture, it can be toxic. And even though those people are placed in certain positions, it doesn't mean that they feel that the workplace is inclusive. So I think, again, to go back to the marketing, you can say whatever you want, but then there's always a specific story when you look under the covers, when you really look at the culture of a workplace. And, to your question about how do you ensure that all voices are included, I actually don't know, because I don't think I've ever seen it. I've seen a lot of people who are afraid to speak up. I've seen a lot of people who don't want to be labeled as difficult. They don't want to rock the boat, and it's a huge challenge. And yeah, I actually don't know how to answer this, because it's a tough one.
Yeah, when Leela, Mark, when Leela, you mentioned about the beautiful website, it also made me think of, make sure you have the cutest kids in front of the kids hospital that we're donating to when we have the big check or something along those lines. Is it can feel maybe more of a marketing opportunity versus something that they truly have invested in and care about. Mark, sorry.
Yeah, no, not a problem. I was just going to bring maybe a different perspective, because I think we all agree that it's a very difficult and challenging to have all voices included, and you might not get anywhere if you have to do that. But from, again, more of an Indigenous perspective, there are many instances that I know that Indigenous people don't want their voice to be heard. It seems somewhat counterintuitive, but there are a lot of instances where Indigenous peoples, and I think Ivana mentioned the idea that House is going to be used against us. There's always a sense of distrust in a system that you've never had the ability to trust in. All of a sudden, saying, "Hey, we want to hear your voice, and we want you to be part of this consultation. We want you to your voice and are important to us. Is it, well, why now? How is this? How are you going to use this? And it goes to motivation, but other things. Sometimes it's more of a legal issue. Where companies have to consult and they have to accommodate with Indigenous peoples, and sometimes these are mega billion-dollar projects, and they say, we really want your voice, and I said, well, that's legally speaking, you have to have our voice, but no, you're not getting our voice, and you're not getting our agreement, and we're not participating. And so, it's both internal to organizations and external in many cases, where, like I said, Indigenous people, either because it's consultation fatigue, that there's just so many people coming and wanting Indigenous peoples to be a part of, whatever process they're involved in, that they don't have the resources, they don't have the capacity to keep up with the demand. And the other side of that coin is, an issue of trust a lot of times of, well, if I give this information, how is it going to be used, and how is it going to be used against me? Is a question they might not articulate, but it's a question that circulates in the back of the mind, thinking that you were never that interested before and now you are. So how does that work for me, and how does it work against me? And it's more that against me. A lot of times that people, I know from an Indigenous perspective, that they say, no, I'm not going to participate. I'm not going to be part of the conversation. And no, I'm not going to go out on a limb, because there's usually somebody sawing behind me when I do. So there is that trust factor, and I think there are other considerations that come to bear when you look at inclusive and including groups that have not been part of that conversation to date, and looking at motivations and use and how that either benefits or works to the disadvantage of the groups that are now being asked to do something which is entirely new.
Yeah, I definitely have picked up on the element of mistrust on social media, for example, when I have seen people speaking out and saying, please stop coming to me to ask me for my opinion or how you can be more inclusive. And in many cases, it sort of felt like organizations were asking people, how can we not offend you in our next message or in our next campaign? So it didn't even feel like they wanted to do it. They just wanted to make sure that they're not going to upset an entire segment of potential consumers. And it felt sort of disingenuous. And so I'm actually very glad when people speak out and say, stop coming to me for advice on how not to offend a huge segment of the population, because I don't think that's what we're trying to get across as being the important part of inclusivity. I did wonder if you've seen a difference, whether inclusivity is sort of organic, and I don't think anything is ever really either exclusively top-down driven or exclusively bottom-up driven or anything like that. But I did wonder if you've seen inclusivity be more effective when it's top-driven, or if it's, I often see, we have this committee and we need someone from every single faculty as part of this committee, or someone needs to be tenured and we want non-tenured, and we want we need people from the library, or we need someone from every part of Brock, for example. And I did wonder if it does need that top-down approach.
I think it's important for whomever is moving the initiatives forward that they have the ability and the support from leaders within the organization in order to make recommendations and change. So whether that committee, as you referenced, is top down or bottom up or something in the middle, there has to be an openness and level of acceptance for those recommendations and change to be brought forward.
Anyone else? Ivana?
Yeah, I agree with everything Yvonne says. I think it's not so much about top down or bottom up. I think there just has to be commitment at the top, where leaders have to demonstrate commitment with their actions, because at the end of the day, I think there's only so much employees can do, because so much of the business decision making does happen at the top. So I think it can and should happen at every level, but without the commitment from leadership, it may not go far. And that's, I think, the sad reality that I've seen at some places, because then the employees feel discouraged and accept the reality for, well, this is just how things are, and they accept it, which is, again, not the desired outcome of all of this.
Thanks very much. Leela.
I think that for me, there might be a difference between something that is organic and then top down or bottom up. I think, as everyone said, that it's very hard for initiatives to take root unless there's some buy-in from the top. I think that, people who know what it's like being at the bottom may have brilliant ideas, but putting them out into the ether is going to be very worrying as to what might happen to you, particularly if it's a critique of those at the top. However, I think if there was the possibility of creating something that was more organic, it would require, and had everybody, I think it would happen in a smaller way. I'm not sure in an entire organization, but I think it could happen amongst a group of people who develop their own way of having dialogue and conversation and the ability to get along, which could be a model that is then looked at that, this group has just, I don't know, their productivity has just risen so much in the last little while. What are they doing differently? And, someone at the top might say, I don't think they're doing anything differently, and go in and ask. And they've been deciding to have 5-minute conversations about different topics before they begin every meeting or something. I don't know what it might be, but I think there's the ability for something organic to occur in a smaller way. But otherwise, I think I agree that unless there is, unless people know there's actual commitment, it almost seems like it's wasted energy to start working on something. Because for people, especially those who are marginalized, already expending a lot of energy just to move through the world, to expend more energy in a workplace is just too much.
And Mark.
Yeah, so I was trying to think of examples of, organizational dynamics being as complicated as it is, and looking at, questions of organic versus, policy-driven through an organization. I was trying to think of organic examples, and all the examples that I've looked at of organizations that have been very effective at being more diverse and becoming more diverse, and inclusive leadership and inclusive decision-making have all been because of conscious, concerted, focused effort at some level, usually supported by the top. I was trying to think of examples where the leadership was not for this particular initiative, and it flourished anyway, or a change of leadership that comes in, and the one leader or leadership focus was yes to have a diverse workplace, and the next wasn't. I've seen that being undermined and lose steam very quickly. But I've never seen it happen, like I said, organically without, like I said, some conscious, concerted, focused effort at some level of the organization, certainly supported by the top, where this has been successful or has flourished within the organization, setting aside what the definition of successful might look like, but has flourished and become somewhat organic after that, knowing that it's supported by the C-suite, it's supported by the top, and yes, I think the expectation is that my team should be more diverse and more inclusive. So you're doing something which your organization is moving toward already and being supported by the top, and it becomes somewhat organic. But I've never seen it, from my perspective, originate without, like I said, that concerted, focused effort of somebody, or at least the leadership, assuring everybody that yes, this is the way the organization is growing and going, and that they will be supported and rewarded. Should they decide to pick up on this particular initiative and move forward with it. So I think it can become organic, but that always originates from my perspective anyway. Maybe the literature would have something different of, like I said, that concerted, focused, conscious effort by somebody or some team supported by the top doing that.
Todd, could I just add, which it's somewhat what Mark was saying, I think, is I read very quickly, so but what caught my eye was it was a study in the United States looking at universities and the approach they took to inclusion and looking at the effect on the student body. And they were looking at those who took a moral approach, it's the right thing to do, versus a policy approach. We need to do it, so we're going to do it type of thing. Although they would sugarcoat that latter approach, obviously. And not surprisingly, they found out that students who were at the universities where it was a moral approach, so students of color, believed far more in the initiatives that were happening. They saw them as happening around them and felt themselves to be part of what was going on, versus the policy-driven universities where students of color, and I think faculty and staff of color, had very little belief in what was going on, that it was being done simply for the sake of it. And so the very language that was being used within that context to discuss, although both may have been talking about inclusion, depending on the approach they were taking, made a huge difference to the customers, if you were to think of students as the customers in that particular study. So I think there's some interesting work out there looking at these questions.
And we are actually going to transition to questions from the audience, minus the awkward run over with a microphone, which makes this even easier. So maybe we might not do this in person ever again. It's hard to sit now. So the very first question is, if inclusivity really relates to opening a welcoming door, regardless of race, gender, and religion, how do you create a culture of relevance in the workplace? So thank you to our audience who's provided some great questions so far.
This is where I wish we could ask a question back and say, what does a culture of relevance mean? I'm not quite sure. Maybe perhaps that discussion came up while I was offline for a minute, but I'm not sure if you mean making the individuals relevant or making the fact that your workplace is diverse relevant. But I think that, again, goes through the practices and the moral decision-making models or inclusive decision-making models that are in place. The actions, the conversations that happen, and the change that is a result of that may be what we're trying to seek here. I'm not sure if others, probably a better response out there.
I feel in the same boat in terms of, I'm not sure what a culture of relevance means. I think that inclusivity is clearly relevant just in a lot of the topics that we've discussed in terms of, if you were to look at the business case for diversity, you would have the statistics, the metrics to show that a diverse workforce was going to produce a better product. But if the question is more saying that means everybody is bringing their whole selves into the workplace, and how do you deal with that when everybody is then going to be bringing in a lot of differences? I think that's really exciting to be able to think about the ways that if people truly felt they could bring their whole selves into the workplace, what that could do for conversation and discussion. I don't think it means that there would have to be discussion about our identity characteristics all the time, but I do think that it may become relevant simply to be able to feel free to announce something. And I was actually thinking about this earlier today, and this may not be what this question is asking whatsoever, but today is a Hindu, the start of the new year for states in my part of India. And as part of it, the foods that are eaten represent 6 different categories of bitter, sweet, salty, tangy, spicy, sour. And that just, for me, sort of exemplifies the way that the past year has been with COVID. And I could think about ways in which thinking, starting a new year at a time which is very different to the rest of everybody could be a really good way of thinking about, for a workforce. Let's have a restart on this particular day in April because of COVID and see where we can go. I think there's lots of ways that things like that could be made to be relevant. However, I'm not sure that that's the intent of the question.
Yeah, we can, you're right, that the awkward run with the microphone would have provided that opportunity for the follow-up question, but there is interest from the audience to know more about accountability frameworks, and specifically, how do you establish them and then also enforce them? And I believe, was it Leela, were you talking about accountability frameworks earlier, or was that Mark?
I think it may have been Mark, but
Yeah,
I think
and we mentioned the idea. Your earlier comment, Todd, was with respect to metrics and measurements, and within that context, of course, within organizations, you have all kinds of RMAFs, results-based management accountability frameworks. The idea of counting and measuring, and qualitative and quantitative measurements of success or movement towards goals self-identified. How you design accountability frameworks and what you measure, I think, are key elements, because I think, as we all know, we can make numbers tell any story that we want them to tell. So it's important to ask the right questions, to measure the right things in order to give you the data that is necessary to make decisions that are based on, I think, something that based on an accountability framework that that can be challenged and withstand that challenge. I've seen accountability frameworks that have been designed for a specific purpose, and then once they're challenged, then everybody knows the data is not going to be effective, or it's not going to be looked at with a high degree of confidence because there were questions that were leading toward a particular result and the data was skewed. So accountability frameworks, I think, are very important. Most people don't look at the frameworks, they look at the data that comes out of it as being, the quantitative measurements that are important, but designing them, and it's a science in and of itself, but I think designing and how you design them is very important, because that'll determine whether or not the data you get is going to be withstand scrutiny.
Yeah, I was thinking as well about sort of hoping for short-term quick wins. It's similar to my own area of research as well, is maybe some brands think, well, if we include an inclusion or a diversity message, it's going to lead to immediate sales, and then, oh, it didn't. And so now, therefore, let's move away from this. I feel like that happens with CSR sometimes. It's sort of like, well, we'll do it when things are going well, but if we're in a bit of a pinch, we'll remove any environmental practices that might cost us money and so on. So I feel like it could be treated as something that's nice to do, but not always, invested in as sort of a core product or a core service or a core part of the organization, which is unfortunate. We have a question from the audience that's directed towards Leela, moving from being performative to genuine, and what sort of actions can you take that show that your authenticity is at the heart, or is the intent of what you're doing?
I think everybody could probably contribute to that. I think that to a great extent, it's some of the things that we were talking about in saying who we are, who the organization is, why they are looking to change, who they are bringing into the mix to change. I've noticed, because I've been talking to some corporate EDI committees lately, largely because of some initiatives that are national. And I noticed that quite often the entire EDI committee are people of color. And I look at that and I think about, why would that be? And, you know, is it genuine? Yes, the people on that committee have a very genuine feeling they need to change the organization. But how likely is it? What sort of power do they have to be able to do that? And so I think that in looking at where an organization is going, its starting point, it's hard. Authenticity, and I would say, is actually one of those things that I think that after a while, you know it when you see it. You just kind of feel this is, yeah, they are. And some of it's because they'll probably say, we're making mistakes. We're not perfect. We're thinking about this in a number of different ways. But we're intent on getting it right. And we know it may take us, we're not looking for the quick result next year. It may take us 5 years. I think you start to look at the fact that moving to the genuine is really hard, and that you're ready to be able to take that on, understanding it will be difficult, that there'll be bumps along the way, and people might get really angry, and that you're going to stick with it. You're going to have brave space conversations, that you'll understand that the ideas, as Yvonne said, around the cultural safety, but also cultural humility, and the fact that it's a lifetime journey of being culturally humble. And once people start to accept that, I think you start to feel that there's a genuine commitment there that goes beyond dollars and cents and rankings on inclusion charts and the like.
Yeah, I think consistency and commitment to me would signal that they're being more authentic versus a quick hit with a hashtag or a blog post with, you know, I mean, we do kind of live in that world, that consumption that's, you know, here's 10 life hacks to make your life better. And maybe brands want, here's 5 things you can do tomorrow to make yourself more inclusive. And it's a tick box and you feel better about yourself as an organization to say, oh, like we did these 5 things and now we're performing better as a brand. Just cognizant of the time. Yeah,
there's a lot of questions. I was going to say, if we were saying one thing, I mean, some people say, well, if we go with the platinum rule, treat others as they want to be treated, then we could sort of move forward, because in order to do that, you have to be culturally humble. You have to talk to people. You have to think of them as the expert on their own lives. And if we began from that premise, we could move forward. So if people, you know, if that was a hashtag that was going out there, I would look at it and say, okay, there's some authenticity going on in that particular place.
Yeah, my 5-year-old says stuff about treating people the way he wants to be treated and vice versa. And I love it when he says that to other kids on the playground. I mean, it might get him in trouble potentially on the playground with bigger kids. It's hard to say, but yeah, it is something I feel like a lot of us have forgotten over time too. But yeah, so I do want to give a chance to have a few more questions answered. We might not get to all of them, unfortunately. So we'll probably stick with this being the last question, I think. Do you think that most firms or governments who are actively trying to increase representation of minorities in the workplace are doing so by pursuing equality of opportunity or equality of outcome? And this might be another instance of the running with the microphone for more context. I'm not sure.
I'm going to take a stab at this. I think there's a lot of opportunity in having equality and representation and inclusivity. And with that, you will receive better outcomes. So I think that there's probably a bit of both. Now, do I know, again, it comes back to what are the reasons behind, and I think it's hard to say why a government or a particular firm might be doing that without having some context around it. I don't think it's fair to generalize, but I think there's probably truth in both perspectives on that.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what the why is, and it goes back to doing that self-awareness work and being really honest with, like, why are we trying to do this? Are we just looking for the outcome? Are we looking for more sales? Are we looking for better brand campaigns? Or are we genuinely looking to make this organization a better place to work? Maybe if, you know, it's the means versus the ends. Well, maybe if you focus on the means, the ends will take care of themselves.
I think I would look at, and I apologize for parsing the question in this way, but I would look in this context about who we think of as minorities. Certainly worldwide, people of color are the majority. Slowly, I mean, I'm not sure what that means, but taking it as how I would guess. I also think that we need to think and have the conversation about equality of opportunity, equality of outcomes versus equity. There's a huge difference. There's a gulf between equality and equity. And I think that equality of opportunities may not mean much to marginalized communities in a workplace unless there's a careful conversation about equity and the ways that those opportunities may look different for those individuals in order to create a level playing field. And so I think there's a lot of difficult conversations that are hidden within that question in order to be able to move forward in either direction in terms of outcomes or opportunities.
And for that question, I kind of think back. It was a while ago, a few months ago. There was a picture in the Globe and Mail, and it was on social media after this as well. I think it was the Armed Forces, the Canadian Armed Forces. The leadership was sitting around a table, and it had a picture. It was kind of a selfie of the leadership of, it might have been the Navy or the Armed Forces. And the caption was that they're committed to EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that's something that, you know, came down from the Prime Minister, and not only are they dedicated, committed to it, but they're going to pursue this in a very substantive way. And it didn't take long for social media to point out the irony that the table was a bunch of white Caucasian males. I think there was one woman talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion and their commitment to it. And the commitment was one of opportunity, that they want to recruit more people of color and certainly diversity into the armed forces, because the question was asked, well, you mean changing the leadership so it doesn't look like it currently looks now? And they said, well, I don't know if we're talking about that exactly. So it's usually, I don't say usually, but sometimes it comes down to the idea of, yeah, it's equality of opportunity. We want more inclusiveness at certain levels, and we want people to be, you know, come into our organization, not necessarily changing the leadership or the C-suite, or, you know, fundamentally and substantively changing the nature of the organization. You know, we're starting small. These are baby steps. So I think, you know, the question of, you know, equality of opportunity versus outcome is more, I think, skewed towards the opportunity side at this point. Outcome, I think, is happening as more, I think, diverse and inclusive practices are making their way into government and the private sector. But I think it's defined now currently as sort of more skewed towards the side of the spectrum of opportunity and doors being opened, as opposed to substantively changing the organization and how it operates according to these principles.
Thanks so much. We do have two other questions, but unfortunately, based on the timing, that is all the time we have for our discussion. I sincerely thank all of our panelists for taking time and being part of the lead-up discussions, and getting to meet you all virtually has been really nice, and I hope that it happens in person at some point as well. I also just would like to quickly mention that Goodman does host Business Matters every single year outside of last year. And I have a really great team that I get to work with behind the scenes. So Susan, Kaisa, Dylan, Caitlin, and past employees in our marketing comms group have always been really supportive and made this event work really well. And Goodman also provides a lot of services to community organizations. So on the Goodman Group website, there are a list of services that we provide, and our experiential learning opportunities for organizations in the community are great to include in our classrooms as well. And I think, yeah, it's a tough discussion for many organizations, but a really necessary one as well. And even as someone who runs a small organization and a small charity, it made me think, okay, as a person of one who's running an organization, how do I look at that for inclusivity, and how do I grow and become a better teacher as well? And so I really thank you very much for your time and all your thoughtful advice. And also thank you to all of those who we can't see, unfortunately, who are in our audience, who took part and provided some great questions as well. So with that, we'll end tonight. And thank you so much again. Take care, everyone. Please be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, all. Enjoy.